The story of James Cook begins not with grandeur, but with modesty. Born on October 27, 1728, in the village of Marton in Yorkshire, England, Cook was the second of 8 children in a working-class family. His father, James Cook Sr., was a Scottish farm laborer who later became a foreman, while his mother, Grace Pace, was of English descent. Their household was defined by simplicity and hard work, values that would come to shape Cook's character throughout his life. Cook's early environment offered little indication of the global stage he would eventually occupy. Raised in the rural North Riding of Yorkshire, his childhood was steeped in agrarian life. Though formal education was limited, Cook demonstrated early signs of intelligence and curiosity. At the age of 8, his family moved to the village of Great Ayton, where he attended a local school funded by his father's employer, Thomas Scotto. This brief period of schooling provided him with a foundational literacy that set him apart from many of his peers in similar circumstances. Though his schooling ended in his early teens, Cook's intellectual development continued outside the classroom. He exhibited a voracious appetite for learning, especially in areas related to mathematics and geography. These subjects would later underpin his navigation and cartographic skills. After leaving school, Cook was apprenticed to a grocer and haberdasher in the coastal town of Staithes. It was here, near the sea, that he began to feel the pull of maritime life. Historians often point to Cook's time in Staithes as pivotal, not because of the trade he learned, but because of the dreams it stirred. The sight of ships entering and leaving the nearby harbor may have inspired his decision to leave his apprenticeship and pursue a life at sea. In 1746, at the age of 18, he joined the Merchant Navy, apprenticing himself to John Walker, a Quaker coal shipowner in the port town of Whitby. This move marked the true beginning of his maritime education. Cook's early years in the merchant service were marked by rigorous labor and valuable experience. Working aboard colliers that transported coal along the English coast, he became intimately familiar with ship handling, navigation, and the brutal demands of life at sea. Unlike naval vessels, merchant ships offered little in the way of hierarchy or privilege, and Cook thrived in this environment due to his diligence and attention to detail. These formative years honed the technical and practical skills that would later distinguish him in the Royal Navy. More than just a sailor, Cook developed a reputation for reliability and competence. His employers recognized his potential, and within a few years, he rose through the ranks. Yet despite the opportunity for advancement in the merchant marine, Cook made a decisive choice that would alter the trajectory of his life. He volunteered for service in the Royal Navy in 1755. This decision, unusual for a man who could have pursued a secure and respectable career in commerce, speaks to his ambition and perhaps to a deeper desire for exploration and service. The timing of Cook's enlistment in the Navy coincided with Britain's growing involvement in global conflicts, particularly the 7 Years' War. The Royal Navy was expanding rapidly, offering ample opportunities for advancement to those who showed talent and discipline. Cook's merchant experience gave him an edge over other recruits, allowing him to quickly assume positions of responsibility. His first naval posting was aboard HMS Eagle, where he served as an able seaman and quickly earned a promotion to master's mate. While many sailors in the Royal Navy were pressed into service or joined out of desperation, Cook entered by choice and distinguished himself through merit. He combined the practical knowledge he had gained in the merchant fleet with a keen interest in mathematics, astronomy, and cartography, skills that were increasingly valued in a navy looking to expand its reach and accuracy. Cook's willingness to study and improve himself outside his duties made him stand out in a culture that often prized experience over education. Importantly, Cook's background as a commoner gave him a unique perspective among naval officers, many of whom hailed from the gentry. He had no patrons, no noble title, and no inherited privilege. What he did possess was an unwavering work ethic, a methodical mind, and an ability to lead by example. In a rigidly hierarchical society, his rise through the naval ranks was exceptional. His career trajectory underscored the rare, though limited, avenues for social mobility in 18th century Britain. The dockyards of England in the mid-18th century were alive with the clamor of hammers striking iron, the scent of salt and tar, and the ceaseless movement of men and masts. It was in this dynamic world of rising sails and booming cannons that James Cook stepped into the ranks of the Royal Navy. The year was 1755, and the Navy was swelling with urgency, preparing itself for a conflict that would soon stretch across continents, the 7 Years' War. Cook's arrival in this charged environment marked the beginning of a new, more disciplined phase of his maritime life. HMS Eagle stood tall and formidable among the crowded harbor. A 60-gun ship of the line, she embodied the might of the British Navy. Her decks were lined with iron cannons and hardened men, many of whom had been pressed into service. Unlike them, Cook had joined voluntarily. The ship buzzed with activity, officers barking orders, sailors hauling ropes, and climbing rigging like spiders on a web. It was into this scene of noise, precision, and hierarchy that Cook quietly inserted himself. Not yet remarkable among the many. He was assigned as an able seaman, but his merchant training soon became evident. He moved with confidence, performed his duties with care, and absorbed naval routines with an almost academic attentiveness. While others idled between watches or sought out distractions in port, Cook studied. He carried with him a small collection of navigational texts and borrowed others when he could. His evenings, when not on duty, were often spent poring over charts and practicing calculations by candlelight below deck. The Royal Navy was a rigid institution, its hierarchy firmly set, its discipline often brutal. Sailors were flogged for the smallest infractions. Defiance was met with swift punishment. Yet within this iron framework was a strange meritocracy. Those with talent, especially in navigation and cartography, could rise. Cook's skills did not go unnoticed. Within 2 years, he was promoted to master's mate and soon afterward took the master's examination, earning him a position responsible for navigation, a vital and highly respected role aboard any warship. During these early naval years, Cook's world expanded. HMS Eagle patrolled the English Channel, engaged in skirmishes with French ships, and escorted merchant convoys. Through these operations, Cook learned the rhythms of naval warfare, the smoke and recoil of broadside cannon fire, the anxious silence before a boarding maneuver, the careful diplomacy required in foreign ports. He became familiar with maritime logistics, battle strategy, and the fine art of command, all crucial elements of the naval officer's craft. In 1757, he was transferred to HMS Pembroke, a 60-gun ship headed for the North American theater of war. This assignment took him across the Atlantic for the first time, where the dense forests of Canada and the icy waters of the St. Lawrence River replaced the gray coasts of England. The war was shifting westward, and with it, the Royal Navy played a key role in the capture of French territories. Cook's role in these operations was more than that of a passive observer. He began to actively shape them. As master of the Pembroke, Cook was tasked with surveying coastal waters in preparation for military action. The British assault on the French stronghold of Louisbourg depended on accurate charts. With painstaking care, he sounded depths, noted landmarks, and created maps that guided the British fleet safely through treacherous waters. His work was so precise that it impressed senior officers, some of whom would later recommend him for even more complex assignments. Cook's instruments were his true companions: sextants, compasses, lead lines, and chronometers. Each tool was part of a meticulous dance of observation and record-keeping. He often sketched coastlines himself, shading estuaries, marking hazards, and noting tide patterns. It was during this period that his passion for cartography blossomed into a defining talent. Unlike many of his peers, Cook saw the map not just as a tool of war, but as a form of truth, a way to bring order to the world's chaotic and unmapped corners. By the end of the war, Cook had earned a reputation as a master navigator and a reliable officer. Yet what truly set him apart was his curiosity. While many around him sought fortune or glory, Cook sought understanding. He observed the natural world closely, the way the wind shifted near cliffs, the way seabirds gathered near shoals, the way currents bent around unfamiliar coastlines. He asked questions no one else bothered to ask, and in the silence between battles, he searched for answers in the stars, the sea, and the shore. The Royal Navy, with all its iron discipline and tradition, had given Cook the opportunity he needed. It had tested his resolve, sharpened his skills, and placed him in a network of officers and scientists who would one day support his greatest ventures. The morning mist clung to the surface of the St. Lawrence River like a soft veil as James Cook stood at the bow of a small survey boat, eyes fixed on the distant outline of the coast. A leather-bound notebook rested in his hand, its pages filled with calculations, sketches, and notes made in the cramped light of the previous evening. Around him, the waters of eastern Canada whispered the secrets of a rugged and unfamiliar land, and Cook was determined to uncover them with precision and care. His mission was no longer merely to serve. He was now to chart, measure, and define. It was 1758, and the British campaign to capture Quebec was in full momentum. The success of the entire operation hinged on one deceptively simple task: finding a safe passage for the British fleet through the narrow and treacherous channels of the St. Lawrence. This was no small feat. The river was unpredictable, laced with hidden shoals, sudden shallows, and craggy outcroppings that could splinter a ship's hull in seconds. For the British, failure meant disaster. But for Cook, it was an opportunity to prove himself with ink and compass. Day after day, he and a small team of sailors rowed out into unknown inlets, dropped sounding lines, marked depths, and sketched coastlines. The sun beat down on their backs during the long hours, and the cold winds of northern summer offered little relief. Cook recorded every landmark: the bend of the river near Alderlands, the silhouette of Montmorency Falls, the layout of the riverbanks flanking Quebec's imposing cliffside citadel. He transformed an uncertain wilderness into navigable knowledge, stroke by stroke. What distinguished Cook's work was its methodical nature. He applied a rigor to his maps rarely seen in that era, double-checking bearings, triangulating positions, and cross-referencing tide patterns. His charts were not just guides, they were tools of strategy. When General Wolfe launched the decisive assault on Quebec from an unexpected angle along the cliffs at Anse-au-Foulon, he did so in part because Cook's surveys made it possible. The river had revealed itself, and Cook had captured its form with unerring clarity. After the fall of Quebec, Cook's assignments only grew in scope and complexity. He remained in North America, now stationed along the coast of Newfoundland, a rugged land known for its dangerous weather and jagged coastline. With winter winds screaming off the Atlantic and fog rolling in thick as smoke, he set about the painstaking task of charting its vast, irregular shores. The work was solitary, laborious, and often perilous, but it was also where Cook's transformation into a master cartographer truly solidified. Newfoundland's coast demanded more than just technical skill. They required endurance, creativity, and unshakable attention to detail. Cook and his crew traveled in small boats, often navigating through narrow fjords, past sheer cliffs, and into rocky coves where larger ships dared not venture. At night, they camped on uninhabited islands or huddled under tarps aboard deckless vessels. With his sextant and chronometer, Cook measured latitudes and distances to degrees of accuracy that astonished even his superiors. The resulting charts were more than administrative reports. They were revelations. Cook's maps of Newfoundland introduced a level of accuracy and detail unprecedented in British cartography. Coastlines once guessed at in broad strokes were now drawn with elegant precision. Harbors were clearly defined, depths measured, hazards marked. His maps were so exact that they remained in use for nearly a century. To the Admiralty, Cook had become something more than a ship's master. He had become a scientific mind in service of empire. During these years, Cook's life was split between sea and shore. When not charting the wild coast, he worked at drafting tables in temporary quarters, surrounded by compasses, protractors, and reams of parchment. He corresponded with leading scientists and navigators, developing a professional network that extended beyond the Navy. Though he remained a modest man of humble bearing, his work caught the attention of the Royal Society and other scientific institutions eager to bridge exploration with enlightenment. Yet, even amid his growing reputation, Cook remained committed to the craft itself. He spent hours perfecting the curves of coastlines, ensuring that each harbor's shape matched its reality, that each shoal was accurately placed. For him, the act of map-making was not merely a duty. It was a kind of calling, a way to bring order to nature's chaos. His Newfoundland charts were the culmination of this philosophy. Not just maps, but keys to understanding a remote and perilous world. The Endeavour rocked gently in the harbor at Plymouth, her fresh white sails furled against the rising Atlantic breeze. A modest ship by naval standards, just 368 tons and originally a coal carrier. She had been refitted for a mission that bore more ambition than any vessel of her kind had ever carried. It was the summer of 1768, and James Cook, now 39 years old and newly promoted to lieutenant, stood on her deck surveying the final preparations. Around him bustled a diverse crew of sailors, scientists, and artists, all drawn together by the promise of discovery. Ahead lay a journey across the breadth of the known world. The official purpose of the voyage was scientific. The Royal Society had petitioned the Admiralty to dispatch an expedition to the Pacific Ocean to observe the rare transit of Venus across the Sun, an event that, if measured from various points on the globe, might help determine the size of the solar system. Cook's destination was the remote island of Tahiti, recently sighted by European explorers. Yet this astronomical task, critical though it was, served another, far more tantalizing purpose: the search for the legendary southern continent, Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land. As the Endeavour sailed south along the coast of Africa and rounded Cape Horn, the sea showed its many faces. There were weeks of calm, followed by sudden squalls that howled through the rigging and tested every joint of the ship. The men adjusted, drawn into the rhythm of long watches, communal meals, and the unspoken rituals of life at sea. Cook, ever disciplined, remained a distant but respected figure. He kept detailed logs, supervised navigation, and maintained strict cleanliness aboard the ship, a decision that would later save many lives. In April 1769, after months at sea, the Endeavour arrived in Tahiti. The island rose like a dream from the horizon, green mountains blanketed in mist and fringed with white coral reefs. Canoes burst from the shoreline to greet the foreign ship, and the air was filled with the scent of blossoms and the rhythmic songs of the islanders. Cook anchored in Matavai Bay and, with the help of a local chief named Tapaya, who would later join the expedition, he established a temporary observatory for the astronomical observations. Tahiti was unlike anything Cook or his crew had ever seen. Life on the island moved with a gentleness and grace foreign to European sensibilities. Cook, cautious but curious, allowed his crew limited interaction with the locals, who shared food, dances, and rituals. There was wonder and admiration, but also unease. Cultural miscommunications and unequal power dynamics hinted at a deeper complexity. Still, Cook took extensive notes, recording not only the transit of Venus, but also the social structures, tools, and customs of the Tahitian people. With the astronomical observations completed, the Endeavour turned south. Cook's orders, held in sealed envelopes until the transit was observed, now directed him to search for Terra Australis. For weeks, the ship moved through open ocean and uncharted waters. Wind patterns shifted unpredictably, and the threat of collision with unseen reefs loomed constantly. In October 1769, land was sighted. Cook had reached New Zealand. He spent 6 months circumnavigating both its islands, carefully mapping their coastlines and interacting with the Maori, sometimes peacefully, other times in tense and tragic conflict. New Zealand's rugged coast challenged Cook's cartographic skills as never before. The sheer cliffs, hidden coves, and rapidly changing weather demanded precision and constant vigilance. Each bay and cape was sketched with tireless accuracy, and his charts would later prove so reliable that they were used by sailors well into the 20th century. The Maori people left a profound impression on Cook. Though he often misunderstood their customs, he recognized their courage and sophistication, recording his encounters in respectful, if sometimes paternalistic, terms. From New Zealand, Cook sailed west, guided by speculation and wind. On April 19, 1770, the eastern coastline of a vast landmass appeared on the horizon. It was the first recorded European sighting of the eastern coast of Australia. The Endeavour followed the coastline northward, and Cook named many of its features: Botany Bay, Cape Tribulation, and the Whitsundays. The ship made landfall at what would later become Sydney, where Cook and his naturalists collected specimens and observed the Eora people from distance. But Australia held danger as well as mystery. In June, the Endeavour struck the Great Barrier Reef. The grinding sound of coral against wood echoed through the hull as the ship began to take on water. With calm leadership and tireless effort, Cook and his crew managed to beach the vessel for repairs in what is now Queensland. They spent weeks patching the ship, fending off scurvy with native plants, and waiting for tides to return. It was a sobering reminder that exploration carried not only glory, but also the constant shadow of death. After making further stops in Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, and rounding the Cape of Good Hope, the Endeavour finally returned to England in July 1771, nearly 3 years after it had departed. Cook came home to a nation buzzing with interest in his discoveries. The wind carried more than just the scent of salt and seaweed as the Resolution carved through the Pacific. It bore the weight of curiosity, power, and miscommunication. As James Cook led his second voyage into the Pacific, his ship became not just a vessel of exploration, but a floating threshold between worlds. At every stop along the jagged path of discovery, Cook and his crew stepped ashore into unfamiliar cultures, and each encounter was laced with both wonder and tension. Beneath the surface of every friendly greeting and ceremonial exchange lay unspoken questions about difference, power, and intent. In the Polynesian Islands, where the rhythms of life followed the moon and the waves, Cook found societies that fascinated and challenged his European sensibilities. Their intricate social hierarchies, their celestial navigation skills, and their ritual practices were signs of civilizations as old and complex as any in Europe, though measured by a different clock. Cook, ever meticulous in his journals, described these people with both admiration and detachment. His words sought to understand, yet they were filtered through a mindset shaped by the Enlightenment, a belief in rational order and empirical observation. The arrival of a British ship often began with awe. Natives came to the beaches, drawn by the spectacle of towering masts, shimmering sails, and men with pale skin and strange clothes. In places like Tonga and the Marquesas, the islanders greeted the sailors with songs, dances, and offerings. Cook responded with formal courtesy, bringing gifts of beads, nails, and cloth, items modest in value, yet powerful in their foreignness. These exchanges, while seemingly peaceful, were often the start of complex relationships defined by misunderstanding and unequal expectations. Not all encounters went smoothly. Language barriers led to misinterpretation, and European curiosity sometimes turned invasive. In their eagerness to study and collect, Cook's men often entered sacred spaces, handled ritual objects, and disrupted traditional practices without understanding the consequences. These actions, though rarely malicious, sometimes provoked anger or fear among the locals. Cook, who valued order and discipline, did his best to prevent conflict, but his authority was limited on foreign shores where customs and laws were not his own. In the archipelagos where the British landed, the crew introduced more than charts and trinkets. They brought illnesses, smallpox, influenza, syphilis, for which the islanders had no immunity. The invisible contagion that followed the ships ashore often lingered long after the sails had disappeared over the horizon. Villages that once thrived on ritual and kinship found themselves weakened by disease, their oral traditions forever changed by a single generation's encounter with foreign strangers. Cook's own views on the islanders evolved as he traveled. He began to see them not simply as noble savages, a common term of the age, but as peoples with sophisticated systems of governance and belief. Still, he remained a product of his time, committed to the belief that exploration brought enlightenment, and that British presence, even in its most respectful form, was inherently a civilizing force. He seldom considered that the islanders might view the arrival of his ships not as progress, but as intrusion. Perhaps the most complex of Cook's interactions came during his time in New Caledonia and Vanuatu. The indigenous peoples, they were more wary, more guarded. They received the British with suspicion, and while violence did not erupt, the air was thick with tension. Cook, recognizing the limits of diplomacy, often chose to observe from a distance, using binoculars and longboat excursions to map the islands without always stepping ashore. These moments revealed the fragility of the balance he walked between explorer and intruder, guest and invader. Meanwhile, the presence of Tapaya, the Polynesian navigator who had joined the first voyage and whose memory lingered even after his death, remained a haunting reminder of cultural translation. Tapaya had served as a bridge between worldviews, a voice who could interpret rituals, navigate open waters without instruments, and explain the islanders' ways in terms that Europeans could understand. Without him, Cook and his crew were often left guessing at meanings they could not grasp. Tapaya's absence was a silence that underscored the challenges of true cross-cultural understanding. Cook maintained strict discipline aboard his ship, but on land, control slipped easily through his fingers. Trading often turned to theft. What was offered in hospitality could be mistaken for tribute. What was taken as curiosity could be seen as sacrilege. These misalignments led to tensions that occasionally erupted in violence. In one instance in the New Hebrides, a disagreement over the theft of a hat escalated into a skirmish, leaving an islander wounded and the crew shaken. Such moments were recorded with brevity in the ship's logs, but their impact on local memory would be far longer lasting. By the time Cook completed his second voyage, he had charted vast swaths of the southern Pacific and had crossed the Antarctic Circle further south than any man before him. The sky above Plymouth was a slate gray when James Cook once again boarded a vessel bound for the vast Pacific. It was 1776, and though he had already traversed most of the known ocean and earned the esteem of Europe's scientific and naval communities, there remained one elusive mystery: the Northwest Passage. The third voyage was to be his most ambitious, an attempt to find a navigable route connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans through the Arctic, a quest that had lured explorers for centuries with dreams of trade and empire. Cook was no longer a rising officer. He was now a legend steering into the unknown. The ship's Resolution and Discovery were outfitted with reinforced hulls, experimental heating systems, and extra supplies. They carried chronometers for precise navigation, barrels of preserved food, and volumes of charts Cook himself had produced. The journey began with an air of solemn resolve rather than fanfare. Cook, older now and wearied by years of sea and diplomacy, maintained his stern discipline and meticulous habits. He had little patience for ceremony. The sea, he knew, demanded focus, not fanfare. Sailing southward across the Atlantic, the ships paused briefly at the Cape of Good Hope before pushing onward toward the Indian Ocean. This leg of the voyage was long and uneventful, a vast stretch of ocean broken only by the rhythms of daily life aboard ship. Maintenance, navigation, illness, and the constant adjustments of course and sail. It wasn't until they reached the southern Pacific once more that the voyage took on a new urgency. From there, Cook plotted a route northward, intent on reaching the uncharted coastlines of North America's Northwest. In early 1778, land came into view. Mountains rose behind thick green forests, and the salty air carried the tang of pine. Cook had reached the Pacific coast of what is now Oregon and British Columbia. For weeks, he meticulously charted the shoreline, sailing in and out of bays, naming inlets and headlands as he went. The people he encountered along this wild, damp coast, most notably the New Chenulth and Haida, were unfamiliar with Europeans. Yet their canoes, crafts, and carved totems spoke of a rich, deeply rooted culture that had thrived for generations in harmony with land and sea. These coastal communities were fiercely independent and sharply perceptive. They watched Cook's ships with cautious interest, sometimes approaching in war canoes, other times offering fish, pelts, and stories in exchange for metal goods. Cook, as always, kept a detailed record of these exchanges. The fur trade, he noted, was thriving among the native peoples, long before European economic systems had reached these shores. The region's abundance, its rivers teeming with salmon, its forests filled with game, suggested a resilience and prosperity that defied European assumptions about wilderness and civilization. With the coast of North America mapped as far north as the Bering Sea, Cook turned his attention to the Arctic. He pressed forward along the Alaskan coast, into narrowing straits and colder winds. The sea began to change. Ice floes drifted past the hull, and the temperature plummeted. Sailcloth stiffened in the frost. The sun lingered low on the horizon, casting long shadows over a world of rock, snow, and silence. As the ships neared the Bering Strait, the dream of the Northwest Passage flickered, tangible and terrifying. But the Arctic would not yield its secrets easily. In August of 1778, Cook's ships were stopped by a wall of ice stretching from shore to shore. No passage could be found. The sea hissed and cracked, pushing the vessels back with irresistible force. Cook tried again from another angle, then again, probing along the coast like a blind man feeling his way through a maze. Each attempt ended the same: ice, storms, and bitter cold. Eventually, battered and weary, he turned the ships southward for the winter. It was during this return journey that the expedition stumbled upon the Hawaiian Islands, then unknown to Europeans. The islands emerged like emeralds from the Pacific, lush and sun-soaked after the chill of the north. At first, the reception was celebratory. The Hawaiians, whose spiritual beliefs included legends of returning deities from the sea, welcomed Cook with extraordinary reverence. He was offered food, gifts, and even sacred honors, all of which he accepted cautiously, aware of the fragile line between respect and imposition. Cook remained in Hawaii for several weeks, establishing contact, taking notes on local customs, and observing the island's rich culture. The volcanic landscape, the intricate system of kapu laws, and the islanders' navigational skills struck him with admiration. But time, resources, and patience were growing short. Tensions began to rise over thefts, real and perceived, between the sailors and locals. Cook, who had always valued order above all, struggled to maintain authority amid misunderstandings and growing hostilities. In the weeks that followed, Cook's mission teetered between progress and peril. He had not found the Northwest Passage, but he had opened new doors in the Pacific. He had witnessed the raw edge of the map, the outermost boundary of known geography, and stared into the blank spaces that still defied comprehension. Though he would return to Hawaii again, fate was circling. The next encounter on those warm, volcanic shores would not be one of celebration, but of consequence. The morning sun rose gently over Kealakekua Bay, casting golden reflections across the still water. On the slopes of the surrounding hills, groves of breadfruit trees swayed beneath a soft breeze, while smoke curled lazily from the thatched huts of the nearby Hawaiian village. It was January of 1779 when James Cook returned to this bay, unknowingly sailing into the final chapter of his life. The welcome he received mirrored his first arrival months earlier, joyous, reverent, and ceremonious. Yet beneath the surface of this apparent harmony, change was brewing. Cook's reappearance coincided with the Makahiki Festival, a sacred season in the Hawaiian calendar dedicated to Lono, the god of peace, agriculture, and fertility. The timing could not have been more symbolic. The islanders, interpreting Cook's ships and arrival as divine, once again treated him with deference and honor. Ceremonial processions greeted the British party. Priests offered chants and gifts. High-ranking chiefs offered their homes and support. Cook, though careful not to overtly claim any divine status, did little to dissuade the perception. During the weeks that followed, interactions between the British and the Hawaiians remained largely peaceful. The sailors traded iron nails, knives, and tools for food, water, and wood. The naturalists aboard the Resolution continued their observations, marveling at the agricultural sophistication of the islanders and their social structures. Cook remained focused, but increasingly weary. Years at sea had eroded his health, and the burdens of leadership now rested heavily on his shoulders. He no longer carried the same patience or reserve that had defined his earlier voyages. The calm began to fray when the festival season ended. With the religious significance of the British arrival fading, so too did the reverence surrounding them. Tensions surfaced more easily. Accusations of theft were exchanged. Tools and goods went missing, and misunderstandings multiplied. The Hawaiians, no longer in a season of peace, began to treat the foreign visitors more like men than gods. Cook, in turn, responded with stricter measures, demanding the return of stolen items, detaining islanders, and heightening the air of mistrust. The situation deteriorated further when a storm damaged the Resolution's foremast, forcing Cook to delay his departure. The ship limped back into Kealakekua Bay for urgent repairs. What was once a joyous return now felt like an unwelcome imposition. The local population, already strained from weeks of provisioning the British, viewed the reappearance with suspicion. Cook, frustrated by ongoing thefts and growing resistance, began issuing harsher commands. His authority, though respected aboard ship, became less effective on land. On the morning of February 14th, a turning point arrived. One of the expedition's smaller boats was stolen during the night, a common occurrence during long stays ashore, but one that Cook took personally. Seeking to recover the boat and assert control, he hatched a plan to take Kalaniʻu, the high chief of the island, hostage until the item was returned. This tactic, while used successfully in past encounters, would prove catastrophic in Hawaii, where chiefs were considered sacred and their persons inviolable. Cook and a small contingent of Marines rowed ashore at dawn, heading directly to the chief's residence. At first, the plan seemed to proceed as intended. The chief, perhaps out of respect or confusion, agreed to accompany Cook to the shoreline. But word spread quickly among the Hawaiians, and by the time they reached the beach, a crowd had gathered. Voices rose in alarm. Armed men began to close in, and the atmosphere shifted from tense to volatile. Cook tried to maintain composure, signaling calm, but the tide of emotion could no longer be held back. A scuffle broke out near the landing boats. In the confusion, Cook turned his back momentarily to signal retreat. That single act made him vulnerable. A warrior lunged forward, and Cook was struck on the head with a club. He staggered, then was stabbed and fell into the shallow surf. His Marines, shocked and overwhelmed, fired their muskets, killing a few Hawaiians but quickly retreating to the boats. The body of the great explorer was carried inland by the islanders, disappearing from the eyes of his crew forever. The British ships mourned his loss with solemnity. Command of the expedition passed to Charles Clerke, and then later to John Gore after Clerke's own death. The Hawaiians, recognizing the enormity of what had occurred, performed ritual rites over Cook's body. Though fragmented remains were eventually returned to the ship, much of his legacy now belonged to the sea and the people of Hawaii. The moment marked not only the end of Cook's life, but the symbolic end of an era of exploration driven by individual ambition and curiosity. In the years following James Cook's final voyage, the echoes of his journeys reverberated far beyond the islands and coasts he had charted. His maps, journals, and scientific observations became valuable artifacts in European institutions, sacred texts of a new age of exploration. The Admiralty published detailed accounts of his expeditions, transforming Cook into a symbol of rational discovery and imperial possibility. His name became synonymous with precision, courage, and the Enlightenment's ideal of man mastering nature through reason. Perhaps his most immediate legacy was the transformation of global cartography. Before Cook's voyages, the Southern Hemisphere remained a blank space, filled with conjecture and myth. With meticulous observation and painstaking measurement, he filled in these voids. Coastlines once imagined became coastlines recorded. Currents, reefs, and straits were now etched into nautical charts. His accurate mapping of New Zealand, the east coast of Australia, and the North Pacific remained standard references for decades. Cook had redrawn the shape of the known world with a steady hand and a clear eye. In the realm of science, Cook's contributions were equally profound. The voyages served as mobile laboratories, carrying astronomers, botanists, and naturalists to lands never before studied by Europeans. Joseph Banks, though absent from Cook's later voyages, had established a precedent that lived on through the presence of figures like Johann Reinhold Forster and his son George. These naturalists collected thousands of specimens, plants, animals, and minerals, which were later cataloged and studied in European academies. The documentation of new species helped shape the foundations of botany and zoology in the 18th century. Medical advancements also gained traction through Cook's voyages. His rigorous attention to hygiene, diet, and discipline dramatically reduced the scourge of scurvy among his crew. By enforcing a diet that included sauerkraut, citrus, and malt extract, he demonstrated that preventative health measures could sustain life during long sea voyages. This insight became standard naval practice, saving countless lives in the decades that followed. Cook's commitment to his men's welfare left a blueprint for naval health that outlived him by centuries. Culturally, Cook's journeys fed the European imagination with visions of exotic lands and unfamiliar peoples. Artists aboard the ships, most notably William Hodges and John Weber, produced illustrations that were later reproduced and circulated widely. These images, while filtered through Western lenses, sparked curiosity and fascination. In salons, lecture halls, and drawing rooms across Europe, people pored over depictions of palm-lined coasts, tattooed warriors, feathered costumes, and ornate canoes. Aesthetic fascination intertwined with imperial ambition, fueling the rise of ethnography and anthropological thought. At the same time, Cook's legacy was instrumentalized for political purposes. His achievements became tools of empire, cited by expansionist voices as justification for colonization. The lands he had charted and the peoples he had encountered were soon absorbed into broader imperial schemes. His maps served not only explorers, but also merchants, missionaries, and military officers. Australia, in particular, became a focal point of British colonial strategy, its colonization accelerated by Cook's prior observations and surveys. Cook's persona evolved rapidly after his death. Biographers and historians elevated him to near-mythic status, a self-made man, a servant of science, a moral navigator. His humble Yorkshire origins were emphasized as proof of Enlightenment meritocracy, while his tragic death lent his story the shape of a martyr's narrative. Statues were erected, ships renamed in his honor, and schools taught children to admire his discipline and daring. In Britain, he was more than an explorer. He was a national hero who had brought order to the edges of the world. Yet his legacy was not without its shadows. Indigenous voices, long absent from the historical record, began to reinterpret his visits with a more critical lens. In Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, and beyond, the memory of Cook became entangled with colonization, dispossession, and cultural disruption. The same ships that brought scientific instruments also brought disease and imperial oversight. Memorials to Cook, once uncontested, later became sites of protest and reflection, symbols of a complicated past whose consequences were still unfolding. The institutions that benefited from Cook's journeys, museums, naval academies, botanical gardens, continued to expand their influence, drawing on the specimens and data gathered during his travels. His name was attached to countless species, geographic features, and vessels. Yet for all this commemoration, the deeper legacy lay in the changing ways people saw the world. Cook had not merely uncovered new lands. He had redefined the nature of discovery itself. Exploration, after him, was no longer guesswork or myth-making. It was precision, preparation, and documentation. As the centuries passed, the image of James Cook evolved through the shifting lens of history. What was once a clear portrait of a heroic navigator began to fracture into more complex and contested narratives. His achievements, once held aloft as triumphs of reason and empire, became subjects of reevaluation in light of cultural shifts, political decolonization, and academic scrutiny. In the modern imagination, Cook no longer stands simply as a master of the seas, but as a figure whose legacy must be viewed from multiple perspectives: admired, interrogated, and, at times, resisted. In the early 19th century, the myth of Cook was still tightly bound to the ideals of the Enlightenment. He was portrayed as a civilizing force, a bearer of knowledge, discipline, and moral rectitude. British institutions celebrated him as a national icon. His journals were studied in naval colleges. His voyages were taught as paragons of exploration. Statues appeared not only in Britain, but across former colonies, from Sydney to Vancouver, from Auckland to Honolulu. The bronze likenesses captured a man in command, gazing seaward, poised eternally at the threshold of discovery. But as the 20th century progressed, so too did the voices of those whose histories had long been overshadowed by European narratives. Indigenous scholars, artists, and leaders began re-examining Cook not as a solitary genius, but as a symbol of colonial intrusion. His arrival had often marked the beginning of deep cultural disruptions, loss of land, language, sovereignty, and life. For many, especially in the Pacific, Cook became a harbinger of imperialism rather than enlightenment. His name evoked not maps and measurements, but ships bearing foreign laws, strange diseases, and irreversible change. In Hawaii, the site of Cook's death, this reinterpretation has taken particularly sharp form. For some, his killing is viewed not simply as a tragic end, but as a moment of resistance, a stand against the imposition of alien customs and authority. Each year, protests and commemorations clash in tone and purpose at Kealakekua Bay, where Cook's memory is both honored and contested. His statue in Honolulu has been defaced, removed, and re-erected more than once, each alteration reflecting the ebb and flow of public sentiment. Academic historians, too, began peeling back the layers of hagiography that had enshrined Cook for generations. Scholars turned their attention not only to his journals, but also to the indigenous oral histories, artifacts, and ecological consequences of his voyages. The result was a more nuanced portrait, one that acknowledged Cook's discipline and scientific rigor, yet also questioned the ethics of his methods and the broader consequences of his expeditions. His attempts to impose order on foreign shores, once praised as acts of leadership, were now scrutinized through the lens of cultural imposition. Art and literature joined the critical conversation. Writers reimagined Cook's voyages from the perspectives of those he encountered. Poets gave voice to the chiefs and commoners who watched unfamiliar sails approach their coasts. Visual artists created counter-memorials, works that deconstructed the iconography of European exploration and reasserted indigenous worldviews. These reinterpretations did not aim to erase Cook, but to reclaim the narrative space he had long dominated. Even within Britain, attitudes toward Cook shifted. While he remains an important historical figure, public education and media have begun to include the broader context of his journeys. Museum exhibits now pair his maps and journals with indigenous artifacts and perspectives. Documentaries speak not only of daring exploration, but also of complex entanglements. The conversation has expanded beyond celebration, moving into reflection, questioning, and sometimes discomfort. This growing awareness has prompted international dialogues on memory and reconciliation. In Australia, debates about Cook's legacy have become entangled with discussions on Aboriginal land rights, national identity, and the meaning of historical commemoration. In New Zealand, his interactions with the Maori are studied in schools not only as moments of contact, but also of misunderstanding and cultural negotiation. Across the Pacific, communities affected by his voyages continue to find ways to balance historical fact with cultural healing. Still, despite the challenges to his legacy, Cook's story endures. He remains a towering figure in the history of navigation and exploration, and his contributions to science and cartography are indisputable. Yet the grandeur of his accomplishments now exists alongside an awareness of their consequences. This duality, achievement and disruption, precision and presumption, defines the modern reading of Cook's life. It is no longer a tale told from the deck of a ship alone, but from the shores he reached and the people he encountered. In a modern world where satellite imagery and GPS maps reduce the mystery of geography to digital certainty, the figure of James Cook still looms large, not as a relic of past glories, but as a complex symbol of humanity's quest to chart the unknown. More than 2 centuries after his final voyage, Cook's influence continues to ripple through diverse domains, from maritime navigation and scientific inquiry to cultural dialogue and global consciousness. His presence is stitched into the fabric of history, not only through the records he left behind, but through the lasting imprint of his journeys across land, sea, and imagination. Cook's name endures across the globe, embedded in geography itself. The Cook Islands in the South Pacific bear his name, as do Cook Strait in New Zealand, Cape Cook in Canada, and countless other inlets, bays, and promontories. These names, fixed to the maps of former colonial powers and post-colonial nations alike, serve as silent signposts of his legacy. To travelers, they may appear as neutral coordinates. To locals, they can represent layered histories, reminders of encounters that altered the course of communities and ecosystems alike. Maritime institutions continue to hold Cook as a benchmark of navigational excellence. Naval academies around the world study the meticulousness of his charts and the discipline of his command. Though the technology of the sea has evolved exponentially, the principles of observation, documentation, and respect for environmental conditions that Cook exemplified remain foundational. His voyages, reconstructed in simulators and classroom lectures, still offer insight into decision-making under uncertainty, an enduring case study in exploration ethics and leadership at sea. In the realm of science, Cook's expeditions are revisited not just for the data they gathered, but for the methodology they pioneered. His integration of naturalists, artists, astronomers, and surveyors on long-range voyages became the prototype for interdisciplinary fieldwork. Contemporary climate researchers and conservationists examining ecological baselines occasionally return to the records of Cook's voyages to understand pre-industrial environmental conditions in remote parts of the globe. In this way, Cook's journals serve as both historical documents and scientific benchmarks. Museums and universities continue to curate his legacy through rotating exhibitions and evolving scholarship. The materials collected during his voyages, objects, drawings, specimens, and written accounts, are subjects of constant re-examination. Increasingly, these institutions collaborate with indigenous communities to reinterpret the materials in more inclusive and nuanced ways. Dialogue replaces didacticism, and exhibitions now often frame Cook's journeys as intersections of multiple worldviews rather than unilateral feats of empire. In literature and film, Cook remains a compelling figure, a symbol of ambition, intellect, and contradiction. Biographers probe the man beneath the myth, seeking to understand his motivations and internal conflicts. Filmmakers explore the dramatic tension between curiosity and conquest, using his story as a mirror for larger human themes. In fiction, Cook appears both as a protagonist and as a ghost, a man who arrived on distant shores and left behind questions more enduring than his answers. Educational curricula, particularly in countries he visited, often present Cook's story as a turning point in national narratives. In Australia and New Zealand, students learn not only about his maritime feats, but also about the cultural consequences of contact. In the Pacific Islands, his voyages are positioned within a broader discussion about sovereignty, resilience, and the preservation of ancestral knowledge. These varied approaches to teaching Cook's history reflect an increasingly global effort to balance multiple truths within a shared past. Beyond academia and institutions, Cook's story continues to shape personal identities and local communities. In coastal towns once visited by his ships, festivals, memorials, and reenactments mark anniversaries of arrival. In others, grassroots movements advocate for renaming sites or reinterpreting commemorative events. This dual presence of celebration and contestation illustrates how Cook's legacy remains alive not only in archives, but in the living memory of places and peoples whose histories were transformed by his voyages. Modern exploration, both on Earth and beyond, often invokes Cook as a spiritual predecessor. When astronauts and deep-sea researchers speak of pushing the boundaries of the known world, they sometimes reference Cook's meticulous preparation, his embrace of the unknown, and his capacity to unite observation with discovery. His model of holistic exploration, combining science, diplomacy, and documentation, resonates in missions to the Arctic, the deep ocean trenches, and even the surface of Mars. In the end, James Cook's enduring presence is not confined to the pages of history books or the names on maps. It lives in the questions his life provokes. How should we remember those who explore foreign lands? What balance exists between knowledge and power? And how do we reconcile the achievements of a man who expanded the horizons of the known world while forever altering the lives of those who lived just beyond them? These questions continue to echo across oceans and centuries, calling each generation to look both outward and inward as they navigate the boundaries between discovery and understanding.